to become habitual, to be set in our ways, to be stubborn. Rather, the church can indeed be an innovator. The church can adapt to its surroundings, but only when the gospel message is central. You say, well, what if we are moved off the hope of the gospel? What is the cost to us if we lose our focus on the gospel? What happens to an individual? What happens to a church? What happens to a denomination if they wander away from the gospel? Well, what does our faith in Jesus Christ offer us? It offers us hope. It offers us purpose. Those who have lost sight of the gospel will lose both. Where is the hope without forgiveness of sins? Where is the purpose if not to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? What is the reason to be a church if not to embrace and share the gospel? Doesn't our world have enough social clubs already? Don't we have plenty of charities for this and that? But we only have one place where freedom from sin is preached. We only have one place where lives are redeemed that were lost. This, as our text says today, is the gospel that you have heard. Let's think for a moment about the saints who have gone before, about those who paved the way for us to be here this morning. You see, the earliest churches were founded directly by the apostles, by Paul, by Peter, by James, by the early people who saw and spoke to and were eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus Christ. The early churches were founded by them. Eventually, the gospel was spread by those who had become believers based on the testimony of the apostles. If you fast forward past that first generation of the church, the principal keepers of the legacy of the apostles becomes the text of the Bible. The church spreads through the text. The gospel, the letters preserved from Paul, from Peter, from others, they were accepted by the early church and became the basis of spreading it. Fast forward another 2,000 years. Heretical movements have come and gone. There have been periods of corruption in the church. There have been periods of reform. There was the Great Schism separating the East and the West. There were the Crusades, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, movements, one and all. There was a shift of focus. The church began in Jerusalem, and eventually the focus moved from there to Rome and Alexandria, and eventually from those cities to Constantinople. The shift of focus went from the Middle East to Europe, from Europe to the Americas, and now much of what the church is doing in our world today is in Africa and Asia. Most of the growth in the church today is not in America. It's in Africa. It's in Asia. After more than 100 generations, depending on how long you count a generation, we've had at least 100 of them since the founding of the church. The gospel that was declared by Jesus and recorded by his apostles is incredibly and miraculously still available to us today. Think about that. 100 generations and we still have the same gospel. We have in English now the same words that the church of Colossae received from the Apostle Paul in Greek. The same message that he gave them, we can hear today. And yet, people are looking for another gospel. Despite this impressive history, there will always be some who want to clarify, who want to purify the message of the gospel away from its original intent. But keep in mind, the gospel is supposed to shock. It's supposed to offend the world. We're not supposed to conform the gospel to the world. We're supposed to confront and change the world through the gospel. And yet, this is nothing new under the sun. Contrary to our own conceit, the same heretical notions that are alive today have been recycled throughout church history. The need for the Nicene Creed, I mentioned it earlier, was because a man named Arian was promoting his own ideas. His idea was that Jesus was created. He was not like God. He was basically a man. Arian lived from 250 to 336 AD, and he was a presbyter. He was a church leader in Alexandria, in one of the hearts of Christianity. Where else would you expect heresy to come from but from the inside? We're not going to accept it from the outside. It is going to come from church leaders. And this didn't take place in a vacuum. There were other people out there selling similar ideas to Arian. And there were other people out there espousing the opposite view, which was Gnosticism, which is what the Gospel of John, the letters of 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, are all confronting. The idea that Jesus wasn't really human, he was just God. On both ends you had the debate going on. And so the church got together and said, no, this is the gospel. We will all agree to it. We will all sign this creed. You might be sitting there and thinking, well, that was 325. That doesn't happen today. Well, you're wrong. Not very far from here is Spring Lake over on Lake Michigan shore. There's a Reformed church over there that was in the news about 10 years ago, quite a bit. Because their reverend was preaching that the resurrection is just symbolic. That it didn't really happen. It's a metaphor. Jesus didn't rise from the dead because he was just a man. And what's really important is this whole love your neighbors and do unto others thing. That's the only thing that we really need to take from Jesus. This can happen to any church that doesn't defend and safeguard the gospel. And you might be thinking, well, we all just get up and walk out. You might. But that church is still going today.
I was there 2 weeks ago.
You were?
My son belongs there.
Well, they have problems. Because that is not the gospel. That is not the gospel of the apostles. That is not the gospel that we've preached for 2,000 years.
They have changed too in the last few years.
I hope so.
You have to go once in a while there to know what.
Well, I just go by what was in the newspapers reporting, and he was proud of that view at the time, so I hope they have changed, because that is very dangerous stuff. And just because they've changed doesn't mean it's not gone somewhere else. It goes around. Well, whatever new idea you hear that seeks to replace or fix the gospel isn't new at all, is it? Our ancestors in the faith fought the same battles. We are here today in a Bible-believing church that continues in their tradition because they had victory over those heretical ideas, because they preserved the truth of the gospel, along with hundreds of other churches and individuals over the years that have preserved the gospel that we can preach here today. And we can fellowship with other churches who share the gospel, because they, in that early church, were willing to come together and say, we are going to be united. So we can fellowship with our Methodist friends. We can fellowship with others, with the Lutherans in Carson City, with other people in Ionia and surrounding areas. We can fellowship with them because we have a common creed and a common gospel that we all defend together. Paul goes on to say, this is the gospel that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. You see, the universal church is everyone who holds firm to the gospel. Everywhere, under whatever name they have on the door. If they hold firm to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is the church. Now, there are certainly some on the fringes preaching some weird things that are going to make us doubtful, that are going to make us worried. But the vast majority of those who claim to follow Jesus Christ are upholding the same gospel that we ourselves cling to. Each individual must prove their worth. Each church must prove that its faith is genuine in the same way, by continuing in the faith. 3 thoughts of applications before we take communion. Number 1, faith is not self-sustaining. It must be maintained, and it must be Secondly, being a Christian is a process. We must all start by coming to Jesus in our faith and in our repentance. And we must all demonstrate our commitment. We must all grow in our understanding. Lastly, it is indeed true that the gospel cannot be defeated. Those who stray from it will shipwreck themselves, either as an individual or as a church or as a denomination. You can destroy it, but the message of God's grace through Jesus will continue to be the light shining in our darkness.